Hi, my name's Jon Reed. I'm a senior partner at Alpha FMC.
And I'm Chris Paton, Managing Director of Quirk Solutions.
We're here today to talk about culture. It's becoming a bigger theme within our industry as many of our clients start to realise the importance of it with respect to the performance of their businesses. So Chris, maybe we start with a sort of fundamental question. What is culture? And when you think about culture alignment, what does that concept mean to you?
My favourite definition of culture is Bill Markline's. It's how your team feel on a Sunday night about a Monday morning. Essentially, culture is the social glue that keeps the organisation together. It's all the little norms and behaviours that happen within a business or an organisation. It's a societal thing, so it forms through the connections that people have between one another. It's whether your team put the coffee cup that they've just used into the dishwasher rather than just leaving it out on the side. It's whether you feel comfortable as an organisation to challenge people within business meetings or things like that. But the important thing for me as well is that it's not a mono culture. There's not one culture within an organisation. There are always micro cultures. Mm-hmm. So at different levels, at different seniorities, in different teams, different departments, there are going to be unique little cultures. So for me, cultural alignment isn't necessarily about how do we get everybody in the same culture. It's how do we recognise those individual cultures and make the most of them? How do we leverage that as a power rather than seeing it as a difference,
Understand, yeah.
And also, where is the culture now and where do we want it to be in the future? That's another key part around alignment. So it's not necessarily alignment between teams, but it's more alignment of the understanding of where we want to be in the future. Mm-hmm. And do you think there's a particular lens that the industry views culture through for yourselves?
I think from an asset management point of view, I mean, your point around microculture is quite interesting for asset management, because we're not talking about huge organisations. We're not talking about banks of 100,000 people. They tend to be a few thousand type organisation, even the bigger ones. So what you find is there will be a handful of leaders, a handful of sort of middle management and their behaviours really set the culture of the teams that look into them. So I think if you can get alignment of those people with respect to what the organisation wants to be and the behaviours it expects of its people, you can quickly have groups of people following and really have microcultures, but ones that drive and deliver the organisation objectives and feel part of the organisation.
Yeah.
Every organisation is different, so no two companies have the same culture. I guess the only quirk I've seen at asset managers is this concept of business and not the business.
Okay.
So
what do you mean by that?
Well, often you different departments within an asset manager, the front office being sales, distribution, and the investment team that make the profits, and then everyone else who services it, the tech, the operations,
the enablers almost.
The enablers, and you have this concept where everyone describes the business as those that make the money, and everyone else is not the business.
Okay.
And I always thought that was an odd quirk, because as an organisation you really need to all feel part of the business. You all need to be pushing in the same direction. Feel like you're contributing.
Yes.
In order for the organisation to succeed. But I mean, I'd be interested. Why do you think cultural alignment is important?
Well, there's some statistics behind it. I mean, the productivity report that was done by Gallup is saying that you get 78% less absenteeism. You get 27% more profitability. You get 17% more productivity if you have a culture that is working really well and cultures that are working really well within an organisation. But we all see it, right? We all recognise it. If we've got a culture that's working well and teams that are happy and people that are engaged, then you get more discretionary effort. There's people putting in a bigger shift, right? You get better outcomes. You get greater creativity and innovation because you can create the environment where people will challenge, will ask questions. So you get that diversity of thinking coming through, you get greater inclusion coming through. But for me, it's also important, not just from that profitability, productivity perspective, but from a client perspective and a customer's perspective, however we want to define that, right? because we can have marketing and marketing going out that talks about our brand and who we are, but culture is how we actually show up.
Yes.
And Russell Clements, who built this incredible business from nothing to this huge PLC, said that culture is your only differentiator. And I really like that, because it helps us define the fact that, within asset management, if it's, who you're outsourcing to, it's how you're treating them. It's how the teams are treating people internally. It's how the customers are feeling.
Yes, yes.
So if you get it right, it's not just about productivity and profitability. It's also about client retention, customer retention, customer attraction. So that for me feels important. And do you feel then, from what you said already, with some of the things that are in your industry, is there a pressure now? Is there a bit more of an urgency to do something about culture?
I think there is. There definitely is. But maybe I'll just pick up on one of the points you made earlier. I often do see within organisations, the same people picking up and staying late, picking up the big tasks and fixing the big problems. And I think maybe leadership teams need to look at that and think, well, hold on, why is it always the same 10 people I give the big stuff to? Why is no one else leaning in? And that may be a signal that there is something to consider from a culture point of view.
Yeah.
But with respect to the industry in general, I mean, the industry's under quite a considerable amount of pressure. Cost-income ratios of the organisations have changed dramatically over the last 5 years, and I don't think it's just going to correct itself. It's not just wait and it's all going to go back to how it was 5 years ago, and it's not going to be that everyone. It's not a rising tide lifts all boats. There are going to be winners and losers. So people are going to need to think about their strategy, and there's going to be quite a lot of transformation that sits behind that. And of course, having an organisation that has strong culture, people who feel connected to the business, people who feel they've got ownership with the business, are going to be able to make those changes better than others. And I think the other thing I'd say is it's the types of changes that are going to come into play.
Right.
There's obviously a big change in technology, AI, but there's also in our industry a shift towards public to private. So if you look at the org structure in 2035 and what did it look like in 2010,
yes,
I think they're going to be markedly different,
right,
and lots of different skills. So what does that mean? There's going to be a lot of people change. There's going to be a lot of restructuring. There's, the organisation's going to look quite different. And when you want to make those types of changes, if you've got cultural dissonance and people who aren't engaged, and you're doing things that they may or may not fully understand or appreciate, it's going to become very difficult. It's when people are aligned to the organisation, feel ownership with it, and can go on that journey with the organisation. I think it makes life a lot easier.
Yeah.
But I'm interested, when you work with organisations, what are the trigger points for them looking at cultural alignment?
They vary. They vary. I mean, one big one that we see quite a lot is new leadership teams, or changes in leadership. Because when any of us come in as a leadership role to an organisation, we want to know what we're dealing with.
Yes.
Right? And if we can get that from going around and spending our first 100 days and trying to get underneath the skin of the organisation a little bit more, but a cultural diagnostic really helps pull that out much quicker. Because it gives you that understanding. It gives you the understanding of the overall culture, but also the micro cultures, but also how leadership is affecting the culture.
Yes.
So then leaders know where they're starting from and have got an idea about where they want to get to. So that's one trigger, certainly. Another one is obviously around M&A, because if you're bringing two organisations together, one of the main reasons that M&A doesn't succeed, nearly over 3/4 doesn't succeed and to achieve the results they were looking for, is because of cultural dissonance and cultural frictions. So that's another big reason. Then it can come down to just productivity and effectiveness. If an organisation feels like we're doing all right, but we sort of sense we could do better and there's something not quite helping us, and that starts to play into these differences that we've talked about, but also some generational pieces as well. Then having that understanding of where it is and what it is can be a trigger. We want to improve, we want to go forward, we want to grow. And I think the final one that we do see quite a lot of now is that increasingly investors, boards, but also customers are insisting on it.
Yes.
Customers want to work with organisations who are demonstrably doing the right things. You know, so we can talk about purpose, and that's great. You know, but the ESG piece that, you know, is something that's a big driver now for a lot of customers in choosing who they go to, and is a differentiator. Well, the environmental piece of that is okay, and we can understand that and get our heads around that. But the societal and governance piece, the ES and the G, is much more difficult.
It's hard to quantify.
It is, right? But that's where culture and cultural diagnostics can come in and help, because you can measure it, you can track it, you can share results about it. And if the regulator starts to come in, or investors say, where are you? You can show how you're making changes, making improvements. So those are definitely all triggers. And all of those.
But it sounds perpetual, right? It sounds as if there may be a trigger point to start it, but once you've started it, it's something you should really be working on all the time and reviewing all the time and making adjustments to.
I think so. It's like any metric.
Yes.
And that's what I believe, you know, is that culture is something that for a long time has been this ephemeral thing that's difficult to put your finger on. And, you know, hence you get the definitions like we had when I opened up and we were first talking. But there are quantitative ways to measure culture, and you can track culture. And I think that is certainly a shift that we're seeing a lot of, you know, and particularly in and around transformation and change and that side of things. And, you know, a lot of the things you mentioned earlier on involve change and changes to the industry.
Yes.
Being imposed externally as well as things that could be internally. So do you think in the industry culture is something that is part of change and considered, or not?
So I think historically it's not. It's an afterthought. I think there's a few little unique cases where it's very front and center.
Right.
Some types of M&A it is, where maybe a big corporation's buying something that's sort of founder owned, and clearly the cultures are very different, and sometimes people don't go ahead because they just can't make that work. But generally I think it's an afterthought. And I was listening to you and I was thinking, I think part of the challenge is people don't know how to measure it, how to manage it, how to think about it, and therefore it just is in the too hard bucket, and they push it to one side. And I think with transformation, it really does depend. I think it is really, really important. And some transformations, the cultural transformation is front and center of it. So if you are doing, you know, some of our organizations are multi-boutique, single P&L to be more collaborative organizations, you cannot start with just merging teams together. You've got to change the culture and the way people think.
Yeah.
Others, there's just general transformation of, an activity that you just need to make sure that there's not that cultural dissonance for it to be successful. You mentioned M&A, but lots of our organizations outsource to other providers.
Yes.
And one of the things I always recommend are, if it's an M&A or an outsourcing, what people should do up front is really align their decision-making processes.
Right.
Now, that's a very small part of culture, but if you've got one organization that's, empower the people, 80-20 rule, just decide and get going, and another that is full committees, 100% right all the time, they are going to bounce and rub up against each other pretty quickly.
Yes.
And if you don't solve that up front, 6 months in, if it's an M&A, you've started to destroy some of the value of what you're doing, and then you end up in that 75% bucket of not being successful. Yeah. So it has not been front and center historically, but I suspect, and clients are now starting to speak to us about, we need to consider culture before we start going on these large transformation journeys. So I think it is starting to become a theme, let's say, in some of our clients.
That's great. It's really reassuring to hear. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, it's really, really great speaking to you today. I hope we hope that was interesting for you, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me, John, and thank you for listening, folks.
Thanks, Chris.